If you hear a dog crying at night, it's not a dog. It all started with a sound, something that resembled a dog's wail, but there was something off, something far too wrong. I'd heard stories about the desert surrounding my town, old legends that the elders whispered, but I never believed them. Not until that night. I went after the sound, curious, ignoring my grandmother's warnings. Now I know I made a mistake. What I found in the desert wasn't a dog. And worse, that thing could turn into anyone. Even me. Nights in rural Arizona had always been peaceful, punctuated only by the soft sound of the wind slicing through the desert trees and the occasional noise from a small animal. I was never one to scare easily. Life in the countryside has its own sounds, its own rhythms. Coyotes, crickets, even the distant howls of wolves were nothing new to me. It was the peace I knew. But lately, something had changed. I remember clearly the first time I heard it. It was almost midnight, and I was finishing fixing the gate when a strange sound broke the silence. It wasn't a normal howl, nor something I could directly compare to any animal I knew. It sounded like a cry, a long, anguished wail, like that of a suffering dog, but at the same time, there was something deeply unsettling about it. That sound left me with a feeling of unease, something I couldn't explain. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe some neighbor's dog had gotten lost, I thought. Either way, it wasn't something that would keep me up at night. But when I mentioned it to my grandmother the next morning, her reaction was unexpected. She was sitting on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, her eyes watching the horizon with a quiet wisdom that only the elderly seemed to have. When I mentioned the sound, she paused the rhythmic movement of her fingers, knitting slowly. Her eyes darkened, and for a brief moment, the silence between us became heavier than usual. "If you hear a dog crying at night," she began, her voice low and firm, "it's not a dog." I laughed, thinking she was just trying to scare me. "Oh, Grandma, please. You're going to tell me it's one of those native legends." She didn't smile back. Her gaze remained fixed, serious. "I'm not joking, Ethan. The elders know these things. You can ignore it, laugh at it, but I'm warning you. There's something out there. Something that uses the sounds we know to trick us." Still unconvinced, I shrugged it off and went back to my daily routine. The farm needed tending, and the fence repairs weren't finished yet. But as the day went on, my grandmother's words began to bother me more than I'd like to admit. Native legends, ancient spirits, it all sounded like campfire stories. Even so, the sound kept echoing in my mind, repeating like a dissonant melody I couldn't ignore. The next night came, and with it, the same sound. This time, closer. It was impossible not to hear it. I was lying in bed, ready to turn off the lights when I heard it again. That wail, like the desperate cry of an animal. I closed my eyes, trying to shake off the paranoia, but the sound cut through the silence of the room like a knife. What once seemed distant now felt like it was right at the edge of the farm. My whole body shivered. I got up, throwing the blanket aside, and went to the window. Outside, the desert was shrouded in deep shadows, with only the faint glow of the moon illuminating the dunes and cacti. Everything was still, except for the wind, carrying the sound of that thing in its cold breeze. I could feel the unease in the air, as if the very ground was twisting beneath something invisible. I knew I should have ignored it. My grandmother had warned me, but something inside me, maybe curiosity, maybe disbelief, pushed me out of the room. I grabbed a flashlight, slipped on my boots, and walked out the back door, feeling the dry, cold ground beneath my feet. The sound echoed between the low trees, at the edge where the desert began to merge with the forest. I followed the noise, each step hesitant but impossible to stop. The night was cold, but sweat dripped down my neck. I moved slowly, focused on the direction of that distorted cry. My hands trembled, but I kept going. Soon, the farm was behind me, and the desert swallowed me whole. Everything around me was dark, except for the dim light of the flashlight illuminating the cracked ground in front of me. The sounds seemed to dance around me, shifting directions, almost as if the thing was taunting me, guiding me further away. Finally, I reached a point where the sound abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was even more oppressive. There was no wind, no crickets, nothing. I was completely alone. The darkness seemed to weigh on me, suffocating. And that's when I saw it. Something moved among the shadows. It was a low, slender figure on all fours. At first, I thought it was a dog, or maybe a coyote, but as it got closer, I realized something was wrong. Its legs were too long, its body deformed, as if it were contorted in a way that didn't make sense. Suddenly, the being stopped, and whatever it was, lifted its head. I stared, my heart pounding in my chest, when I saw its eyes. Bright, red, like burning coals. They stared back at me, and I couldn't move. Fear froze me in place. Then the creature made the sound again, but this time, it was my mother's voice. "Ethan." I instinctively stepped back, stumbling over the hard ground. That wasn't a dog, and it wasn't my mother. I knew that, but my body refused to respond. Desperation took over. Whatever that thing was, it knew who I was. It knew enough to try to trick me. I ran. I ran back to the farm as fast as I could, with the sound of that distorted voice calling after me. When I reached the house, panting, the porch light was on, and my grandmother was waiting at the door, with that heavy look of someone who already knew what had happened. "I warned you, Ethan," she said calmly, as I tried to catch my breath. "Now, it's no longer just a sound. That night was the last time the desert felt safe to me. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting at the kitchen table, too scared to go back to bed. My grandmother was in her room, but she didn't seem worried. She was always like that, calm in the face of things we couldn't explain. The kettle on the stove whistled, and the high-pitched sound echoed through the house, but it couldn't drown out the unsettling silence that had settled around us since the night before. I didn't say anything more after I returned. I didn't tell my grandmother what I had really seen. I didn't know where to begin, and honestly, I didn't want to believe what I had witnessed. Those red eyes, that voice. Something inside me fought against the idea that all of it was real. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, a hallucination brought on by the darkness and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew I was just fooling myself. The hours dragged on, and the sun finally began to rise over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. The relief that should have come with daylight didn't appear. Instead, the feeling that something was wrong only grew. I needed answers. After breakfast, I decided to visit the town sheriff, Bill Monroe. He was a tough guy, the type who had seen it all during his long years patrolling the dusty roads and isolated outskirts of the county. If there was anything to be explained, Bill was the guy who would bring me back to reason. Maybe there was a loose animal or some lunatic wandering around the farm. The town of Willow Creek was small, the kind you pass through in 2 minutes by car. A few shops, a mechanic's garage, the gas station. There wasn't much else. And of course, the sheriff's office where Bill's truck was parked out front. "Hey, Ethan," he greeted me when I walked in, adjusting his cowboy hat in a casual manner. "What brings you here so early? Your grandma okay?" I nodded, but the expression on my face gave away that something was wrong. He noticed immediately. "Not sure what I saw, Bill," I began, trying to choose my words carefully. "But something's happening out there. I don't know what it is, but it's not normal." Bill frowned, crossing his arms. "You're gonna have to be a bit more specific, kid." I explained the best I could, leaving out the stranger details. I talked about the sounds, what my grandmother had said, and how I decided to investigate the desert. I didn't mention the red eyes or my mother's voice. Not yet. Even so, as I spoke, I felt a mix of shame and discomfort creeping over me. I sounded like an idiot. "You're not the first one to say something like this around here," Bill replied calmly, which took me by surprise. A few farmers down south have been complaining about howls and strange things over the last few weeks. But most of the time, it's just a sick coyote or something common. But this doesn't seem like just a coyote, Bill. I insisted, trying to keep my voice steady. Something's wrong, man. I saw. Before I could finish, Bill interrupted me with a nod. Look, Ethan, I get it. I know it can be scary. I've heard stories myself about strange things in this desert, things people prefer not to talk much about. But what you need now is clarity. I'll swing by later and take a look. Bet it's just some wounded animal. Nothing to worry about. Despite his attempt to reassure me, something about the way he avoided eye contact while talking made me suspicious. It was as if he knew more than he was willing to admit. I left Bill's office with more questions than answers. The truth was, instead of feeling relieved, something inside me only reaffirmed that there was much more behind those howls and the creature I saw. Bill could pretend everything was fine, but the entire town was suffocating under an unspoken fear. I felt it in the streets, in the few people who crossed my path with a quick nod, but without wanting to prolong the conversation. Back at the farm, my grandmother was outside, picking some herbs near the porch. The strong smell of rue filled the air. She had always been connected to those old traditions. She knew of plants that healed, that soothed the spirit. But at that moment, the scent brought none of the usual comfort. Bill's coming by later, I said, trying to sound casual. He thinks it might just be a sick coyote. She looked up, weighing my words for a moment before returning to her plants. Maybe, she murmured, but I know what you saw. That caught me off guard. She had never been one to push the legends. Despite the stories she and other elders told, I always thought it was just a way to keep the tradition alive. But now there was something different in her tone. Oh wait, do you think it was… what? I asked, hesitating. A spirit? A skinwalker? She stopped, looking directly at me. Her eyes, a deep brown, carried an intensity one had never noticed before. The legend of the skinwalkers isn't just a story to scare children, Ethan. They were once shamans, powerful men who knew the secrets of nature and the spirits. But some strayed, seeking power where they shouldn't. They become impure things. They can turn into animals, into people. And they like to toy with our minds. They use the voices of those we love, our deepest fears. They confuse and then attack. Every word she said made my heart beat faster. It was all madness. It had to be. But at the same time, I couldn't forget those red eyes or the sound of my mother's voice in the middle of the night. And how do you get rid of it? I asked, my voice more desperate than I intended. My grandmother shook her head slowly. It's not that simple. They feed on fear, Ethan. The more you give in, the stronger they become. That's why I warned you. When you heard the sound, you should have stayed home. Before I could respond, we heard the sound of tires on the dirt road. It was Bill arriving in his truck. He stepped out of the vehicle with the same confidence as always, carrying his flashlight and a shotgun slung over his back. Ready for a walk? He asked, looking at me with a half smile. I knew I shouldn't go, knew there was something wrong with all this, but curiosity still outweighed everything else. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and followed Bill into the desert once again. As we walked, the sun began to set, and darkness spread like a heavy cloak over the arid landscape. The familiar sound of the wind returned, along with the oppressive silence I feared. Too quiet tonight, don't you think? Bill commented, a hint of suspicion in his voice. The walk seemed endless. The twilight faded, and the desert grew darker with each passing minute. My heart pounded in my chest, and the darkness around us seemed to close in. Then the sound came back, louder, closer. The voice, my mother's voice again, calling my name. Bill stopped suddenly. I looked at him, and his eyes narrowed as he fixed his gaze on something ahead. Ethan, he said, his voice now tense, "Stay behind me." He raised the flashlight, illuminating the shadows, and there, in front of us, was something I would never forget. The beam from Bill's flashlight trembled slightly in his hand, but it was enough to reveal what was hiding in the shadows. There, just a few meters from us, something crawled across the dry desert ground. It looked like an animal, but at the same time, it didn't. The elongated and deformed limbs were covered in dirty, twisted skin, as if it had been torn from a human body and stretched over a monstrous shape. The creature's head, low and slender, slowly turned in our direction, and then I saw them again. Those red eyes, glowing like embers, fixed on me. "Stay behind me, Ethan," Bill repeated more firmly this time. I couldn't move. That being seemed to hold me in place, as if my muscles were frozen by fear. My heart pounded in my chest, and everything inside me screamed to run, but my legs refused to obey. The creature began to rise slowly, standing on its hind legs, assuming a more humanoid posture. Its joints cracked grotesquely, as if they weren't used to such movement. And then, from the depths of its throat, came that sound again. It was no longer the wail of a dog, but my mother's voice. "Ethan," the creature whispered, with a disturbing softness. A sensation of deep horror washed over me. That wasn't my mother, I knew that, but the voice was identical. It seemed to pull at me, forcing me to believe the impossible. Bill moved quickly, positioning himself between me and the thing. He pointed the shotgun directly at the creature, his eyes fixed and his breath heavy. "Don't come any closer," he shouted, but the creature didn't seem concerned. It took a step toward us, its skeletal legs bending unnaturally with each movement, and the voice changed. Now, it wasn't my mother's voice anymore. It was Bill's voice. "Bill," the creature said, mocking, as if trying to break the sheriff's resolve. "You're not going to hurt me, are you?" For a moment, Bill's expression faltered. He hesitated. It was as if the very presence of that being was beginning to erode his determination. I knew that, just like me, he was being manipulated. That thing wasn't just imitating voices. It was entering our minds, feeding on our deepest fears, messing with what mattered most. Suddenly, the creature moved with terrifying speed, like a living shadow. Bill pulled the trigger, and the sound of the gunshot ripped through the night silence. The shot echoed across the desert, but the creature dodged, moving with inhuman speed. Before Bill could react, it was on top of him. With a brutal movement, the thing knocked him to the ground. The flashlight rolled away, and the only light left came from the faint moon in the sky. Everything unfolded in seconds. Bill tried to fight back, but the creature was too strong. Its long, sharp claws dug into the sheriff's shoulder as he screamed in pain. The sound of his cry mixed with the distorted laughter of the thing, which seemed to enjoy his suffering. I was still paralyzed. My body wouldn't respond, and terror filled my mind. Seeing Bill, a man I always considered invincible, being overpowered by that thing made me realize the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't a nightmare. It was real. "Bill!" I shouted, finally breaking the silence, but my voice came out weak, almost inaudible. Then, something I didn't expect happened. The creature, with its red eyes burning and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, let go of Bill. It turned to me, as if it was enjoying my fear, as if it were studying me. And suddenly, it began to change. The distorted, animalistic form of the creature began to reshape itself before my eyes. The bones contorted, the skin adjusted, and the thing slowly took on a new form. In seconds, there was no longer a crouching monster. In its place stood me. Yes, me. The creature had taken on my appearance. A perfect copy. It was like looking into a mirror, but a mirror that distorted the soul, reflecting not just physical form but something darker. The eyes of the copy still glowed red, but the rest was exactly like me. "Ethan," my own voice whispered, "are you afraid of who you are?" I felt the air leave my lungs. The fear was no longer just of the creature, but of what it represented. The Skinwalker wasn't just a predator. It was a manipulator, someone who brought out your deepest secrets and turned them into weapons. Bill lay on the ground, writhing in pain but still conscious. He looked at me, or rather at both of us, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Shoot, Ethan!" he shouted, his voice strained with pain. "Shoot!" But how could I shoot at something that looked like me? Doubt paralyzed me, fear and confusion clouding my judgment. The creature took another step toward me, still wearing my face, my body. It seemed to know exactly what I was thinking. "You can't, can you?" the copy said with a sinister smile. "You don't know what's real anymore." Despair spread through me like poison. My head spun, my heart raced, and I felt insanity about to engulf me. But then, amid the chaos, my grandmother's voice echoed in my mind. "They feed on fear. The more you give in, the stronger they become." That was it. The Skinwalker was playing with me, manipulating my emotions to render me powerless. I knew what I needed to do, but courage was slipping away from me. The copy took another step, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. I backed away, my feet sinking into the cold sand. The Skinwalker raised its hand, my hand, as if it were ready to grab me. At that moment, I made a decision. With all the strength I had left, I pointed the flashlight directly at the creature's face and turned it on. The intense light made it recoil for a brief moment, and in that hesitation, I threw myself to the ground, grabbing Bill's fallen shotgun. My body trembled, my mind confused, but I knew there was no room left for doubt. "You're not real," I murmured, more to myself than to the thing before me. The creature opened its mouth to respond, but before it could say anything, I pulled the trigger. The sound of the blast reverberated through the desert. The flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging everything into complete darkness. The echo of the shot faded away, and silence returned. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness again, I realized the creature had disappeared. There was no blood, no body, just emptiness. Bill was still on the ground, gasping and writhing, but alive. I ran to him, trying to help him up. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. "Was it you?" he asked, his voice weak. "It was," I replied, not knowing how to explain. "I don't know what it was, Bill, but we were dealing with something far worse than I imagined." Together, we made our way back to the farm, each step heavier than the last. When we arrived, my grandmother was already waiting on the porch. She didn't seem surprised by what had happened, only sad. "This isn't over, Ethan," she said. "The Skinwalker, it knows who you are now. It knows what you fear, and it will come back." I looked out at the dark desert horizon, where the creature had disappeared. I knew it was still out there, waiting, watching, and now, more than ever, I understood what my grandmother had tried to warn me about. When we hear a dog cry at night, it's never just a dog. Second Skinwalker story. When my father didn't return from the last hunting season, I told myself he'd just gotten lost. That happens sometimes up in the Rockies. A snowstorm can roll in out of nowhere, and even the most experienced men can lose their way. At least that's what I wanted to believe. But as weeks turned into months, that hope began to rot inside me. My mom stopped talking about it. The authorities closed the case after a half-hearted search, blaming the mountains, the weather, anything except the possibility of something more sinister. The other hunters, my dad's friends, they didn't say much either. They'd just shake their heads and mutter things like, "Sometimes the mountains take what they want." I grew up hearing those men talk about the land like it had a mind of its own, like it could get hungry. I used to laugh at those stories. Not anymore. Now, with the first snow of the season dusting the ground, I decided it was time to go looking for answers myself. Maybe I was being reckless, maybe stupid, but I couldn't sit in town anymore, drowning in other people's pity. My dad always took me hunting with him when I was younger. Those trips into the woods were where I learned to track deer, where I learned patience. But this wasn't a hunt for game. It was a hunt for closure. As I packed my gear, the familiar scent of gun oil and leather brought memories flooding back. Long days in the cold, tracking elk with my dad, laughing around the campfire at night. It almost gave me comfort. Almost. The town was quiet when I left, just before dawn. The Rocky Mountains loomed ahead, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky like the edge of a knife. I set off alone, following the same path my father had taken months earlier. By noon, I had reached the tree line, the thick pines casting long shadows across the snow. The air was sharp, almost metallic, the kind of cold that bites deep into your bones. The forest felt different now. Even with the sun high above, there was a heaviness to it, like the weight of the mountains themselves was pressing down on me. As I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. The animal tracks were sparse. It wasn't just that the deer and elk had moved on for the winter. It was like everything had avoided this area, leaving an unsettling quiet in its wake. Even the birds were absent. Just the crunch of my boots in the snow and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. I paused by a small clearing to take a drink from my canteen, scanning the tree line out of habit. That's when I heard it, the cry of a deer, but not just any cry. This was different, more broken. It was a sound of agony, of something being torn apart, but it also didn't quite sound right. Almost human, but not quite. I froze, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The cry came again, echoing through the trees. It wasn't far off. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot. "Dad," I muttered under my breath. I felt stupid the moment I said it. It wasn't him. Couldn't be. But there was something about the sound. Something that dug deep into my gut and refused to let go. The cry echoed again, this time more desperate. Against my better judgment, I turned toward it, moving cautiously through the trees. The snow crunched beneath my feet, the only sound in the otherwise dead forest. The deeper I went, the thicker the trees became, their branches twisting above me, blocking out the sun. I found the tracks soon enough. They were faint, half covered by snow, but unmistakable deer tracks. But they were wrong. The prints were bigger than they should have been, the spacing too wide, almost as if whatever had left them was limping, dragging its weight. My breath misted in the air as I followed the trail deeper into the woods. The cry came again, closer this time, and my heart lurched. There was a clearing up ahead, the trees thinning out just enough to let a sliver of pale sunlight filter through. I stepped into the clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. There, lying in the snow, was the carcass of a deer. Its body was twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. Legs bent at impossible angles, formatted with dark, frozen blood. But its head, the head was untouched, eyes wide open, staring blankly at the sky. It looked like the animal had died in fear, terrified of something that had ripped its body apart without leaving a single mark on its face. I swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in my throat. That's when I heard the rustling in the trees behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. First, I didn't see anything, just shadows between the trees. But then, out of the corner of my eye, something moved, a shape, too fast to make out clearly. My blood went cold. It wasn't a deer. The cry echoed again, but this time it came from the direction I had just come from. I turned back toward the carcass, my mind racing. It was like the sound was circling me, closing in. A chill crawled up my spine as I realized I wasn't hunting anything. Something was hunting me, and whatever it was, it had just begun to play its game. I stood frozen, staring at the torn deer carcass. My breath came in shallow bursts, the cold air stinging my lungs. The sound of that eerie, twisted cry still echoed in my head, but it was the silence that followed that truly unsettled me. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. Slowly, I backed away from the clearing, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. My rifle felt heavier in my hands now, the weight of it almost useless against whatever was out there. I'd always been taught that out here you were never the top predator. But this was different. This wasn't a bear or a wolf lurking in the shadows. This was something else. Something that didn't belong in these woods. Or maybe it belonged more than I did. As I retraced my steps, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it a soft, low murmur. At first, I thought it was just the trees creaking, but it didn't sound right. There was a cadence to it, a rhythm like someone whispering just out of earshot. I stopped and listened closely, my skin prickling as the sound seemed to grow louder, though no words were clear. I whipped my head around, scanning the trees, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing there. But there was nothing, just the endless maze of trunks, gnarled and twisted, casting long, jagged shadows over the snow. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it, but then I heard it again. This time, the whisper was closer. "Dad," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop myself. My voice sounded small and hollow against the vast emptiness of the forest. No response. I wanted to believe it was the wind, but there was something too deliberate about the sound, like it was calling me, pulling me deeper into the woods. And the worst part? It was familiar, as impossible as it seemed. There was something in that whisper that reminded me of my father's voice. Distorted, warped, but there. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. This was madness. He was gone. I had to focus on the tracks, the sounds, anything that could lead me to an answer. My boots crunched through the snow as I moved faster, trying to shake the unease creeping over me. That's when I saw them. Up ahead, just at the edge of the tree-line, were the remains of a campfire, old, long abandoned, but definitely human. The blackened circle of rocks was barely visible beneath a layer of frost, and next to it, I spotted an old, torn tarp half buried in the snow. My heart skipped a beat. I hurried over and knelt beside the camp, brushing the snow away with my gloves. There were scattered remains of supplies. An empty canteen, a crumpled pack of cigarettes, and a knife left half stuck in the frozen ground. But it wasn't the objects themselves that made my pulse quicken. It was the realization that this camp had been here for months, maybe longer. I checked the knife, brushing away more snow to reveal something carved into the handle. I squinted in the fading light, my breath fogging as I read the letters scratched into the wood.
Père.
My father's name. A shiver ran down my spine as I stared at the knife, the weight of it settling like lead in my hand. This was his camp. He had been here. Suddenly, the air around me felt thicker, oppressive. The once faint whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a dozen unseen voices. My hands trembled as I stuffed the knife into my pocket and stood up, scanning the tree-line. I felt eyes on me, watching, waiting. And then the sound came again, that terrible, mangled cry. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was close, too close. My heart raced as I turned, rifle raised, searching for the source. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, shifting with the wind. But nothing revealed itself. The silence that followed was suffocating, a void that pressed down on me from all sides. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another tree, a crooked, dead one standing slightly apart from the others. But as I squinted through the dim light, I realized it was moving, slowly, too smoothly for anything natural. The figure, it was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs too long and a body that seemed to bend and stretch in ways that defied logic. Its skin, or what I thought was skin, was pale, almost translucent, blending with the snow and shadows. But its face, if you could call it a face, was wrong. It was a shifting mass, like it was struggling to hold its form. And then, just for a moment, I saw it. My father's face, twisted, agonized, and stretched over something that was not him. My blood turned to ice. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. The creature's head cocked to one side, and I heard that whisper again, clearer this time, like a dozen voices speaking as one. Jack Haxon. My name. It knew my name. Without thinking, I raised my rifle and fired. The sound echoed through the forest, breaking the stillness. But when the smoke cleared, the figure was gone. Only the trees remained, silent and unmoving as if they had never been disturbed. My hands shook as I reloaded, backing away from the clearing. I had to get out of there. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't natural, and it sure as hell wasn't human. My father... No, whatever I saw, it was playing with me, trying to lure me deeper, just like it had done to him. I spun around, ready to head back toward town, but the trail was gone. The trees seemed closer now, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The way I'd come was no longer there. I was trapped. Panic surged through me as I realized just how deep I'd wandered into the woods. The path I thought I knew had shifted, the familiar landmarks swallowed by the growing shadows. It felt like the forest itself was twisting, changing with every step I took. The whisper came again, fainter this time, but more insistent. Jackson. I had to move. I had to get out of these woods before it found me again. Or worse, before I found it. And then, through the trees, I saw something. A shape, a cabin. I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest. It hadn't been there before, couldn't have been, but in that moment it was my only chance. I sprinted toward it, the wind howling through the trees as the whispers followed close behind. The cabin loomed ahead, a shadow against the dim, snow-laden trees. It didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look inviting either. The wood was old and dark, with patches of rot creeping up from the foundation. The windows were smudged, hiding whatever might be lurking inside. Still, it was shelter, and right now I needed to be anywhere but out in the open. I reached the door, my breath ragged, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The whispers had quieted for the moment, but I could still feel them, crawling at the edges of my mind. My hands shook as I tried the door. It creaked open without resistance, revealing the dark interior. I stepped inside and slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it as I struggled to catch my breath. The cabin was small, a single room with a hearth in the corner. A few old pieces of furniture were scattered about. A table with two mismatched chairs, a tattered armchair near the fireplace. There was dust everywhere, thick and undisturbed, but something about it felt wrong, like someone or something had been here recently, waiting. I moved deeper inside, my rifle still clutched in my hands, but something gnawed at my gut, telling me this place wasn't safe. The walls creaked as the wind battered the outside, making the cabin feel like it was breathing, inhaling with each gust, exhaling with each whisper. I glanced around, looking for anything to secure the door. My eyes landed on an old wooden beam near the entrance. I dragged it across the floor and wedged it against the door, hoping it would hold. Whatever was out there, I wasn't sure a piece of wood would stop it, but it made me feel better, even if just for a moment. The wind outside howled again, a long, mournful sound that seemed to press in on the walls. And beneath it, faint but unmistakable, came the whispering once more. My name, over and over, twisting in the wind, weaving through the cracks in the walls, slipping into my ears like a poison. I needed to clear my head. I moved toward the hearth and found a few logs stacked beside it. After fumbling with the flint, I finally got a fire going. The flames flickered weakly at first, then grew, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. As I warmed my hands, I noticed something lying on the floor near the hearth, half hidden beneath the dust. I crouched down and brushed it off, revealing a weathered, leather-bound journal. The leather was cracked and dry, the pages yellowed and curling at the edges. I opened it carefully, my fingers tracing over the handwritten notes inside. The writing was shaky, desperate, but I recognized it immediately. It was my father's. November 2nd. I'm not alone out here. I thought it was just the cold messing with my head. But now I'm sure of it. Something's been watching me, following me, but it doesn't show itself. I hear it at night, moving between the trees, getting closer. The whispers, God, the whispers won't stop. November 10th. It knows me, knows my name. I can hear it in the wind, calling, taunting. Sounds like me. Sometimes it sounds like Jackson, like it's using his voice. I tried to leave, but the path keeps changing. Every time I turn around, it's different, like the forest is alive, shifting. There's no way out, no escape. November 14th. I saw it tonight. Finally. It took the shape of a deer, but its eyes, they were wrong. Hollow, black. When it spoke, it used my voice, but it was distorted, twisted. It's playing with me, testing me. I can't stay here much longer. I'm losing my mind. Jackson, if you ever find this, don't come looking for me. Get out of these woods. They're not what they seem. The final entry was smeared with dark stains, the ink trailing off as if my father had been interrupted mid-sentence. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. He had seen it too. Whatever this thing was, it had been toying with him just like it was doing with me now. I stood up, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. The wind outside picked up again, rattling the windows, and I swore I heard footsteps crunching through the snow. Slow, deliberate. It was here. I grabbed my rifle, moving toward the window, peering out into the darkened woods. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the trees, swaying in the wind, their branches like twisted, gnarled hands reaching for the sky. But then, just beyond the tree line, I saw movement. A figure. At first, it looked like a man, tall and thin, but as it stepped closer, its form began to shift. The skin stretched unnaturally, its limbs elongating, bending at strange angles. The head jerked and twisted, morphing as if trying to decide on a shape. My father's face, then mine. The creature smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin that split its face in two. And then, as if mocking me, it dropped to all fours, its body contorting into the shape of a deer. Long legs, sharp antlers, but the eyes remained the same. Hollow, black. It opened its mouth, and that awful cry echoed through the night, shaking the walls of the cabin. The sound pierced my skull, sending a wave of nausea through me. I stumbled back from the window, trying to steady my breathing. The fire flickered and dimmed, casting wild shadows across the walls. I could hear the thing outside, pacing, circling, its hoofs crunching in the snow. Then, a voice, my voice, whispered from outside the door. Jackson, come out. It's me. It's your father. I need your help. I clenched my jaw, gripping the rifle tighter, sweat dripping down my face despite the cold. Open the door, son. You're safe here. Just open the door. My hands trembled. It was his voice now, perfectly mimicking the warmth I remembered. But I knew better. I wasn't gonna fall for it. My father was gone. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't him. The door rattled as something pressed against it, the wood creaking under the weight. You can't stay in there forever, the voice said, more insistent now. Come out, Jackson. Let me in. I backed away, retreating to the center of the room, the fire casting long shadows that seemed to shift with each flicker. I could hear it scratching at the door, the sound of hooves shifting into claws, dragging across the wood. My mind raced. I couldn't stay here. It was only a matter of time before that thing broke in. My eyes darted around the room, searching for another way out. Then I noticed the trapdoor. It was small, barely noticeable, hidden beneath the table. I rushed over and yanked it open, revealing a narrow crawl space beneath the cabin. Without hesitation, I slid down into the darkness, pulling the door shut above me. The space was cramped, filled with the smell of damp earth and decay. I could hear the thing outside, now pounding on the door, its voice warping, twisting into something inhuman. "You can't hide from me." I crawled further into the darkness, my heart thundering in my chest, the whispers following me into the earth, growing louder, more frenzied. I could hear it above me, tearing at the door, and I knew it wouldn't stop until it had me. Then, from the blackness ahead, I saw something, an opening, a faint sliver of light. I crawled toward it, my breath ragged, every nerve screaming at me to move faster. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, but I pushed forward, through the dirt and the roots, until finally, I reached the opening. I climbed out into the cold night air, my hands shaking, the wind biting at my face. I was back outside, but the forest, it had changed again. The trees were closer, the shadows deeper. I could feel the presence of the thing behind me, stalking, waiting, and then I heard it, just behind me, the slow, deliberate crunch of snow under hooves. It had found me, but this time I wasn't going to run. This time I was ready to face it. Third Skinwalker story. I'd always known that the wilderness could be unforgiving, but I had never imagined it could feel this. Alive. The Alaskan winds cut through my jacket as I stepped off the small bush plain, the sharp scent of pine and salt water filling my lungs. This wasn't my first assignment studying wildlife in remote locations, but something about this place felt different. The village, if you could call it that, was no more than a cluster of wooden cabins, their roofs sagging under the weight of years. And beyond it, stretching into the endless horizon, was the vast, frozen forest. I was here to investigate reports of unusually aggressive wolves. As a wildlife biologist, I had dealt with my share of unpredictable animal behavior, but the descriptions from the villagers were odd. Packs of wolves howling in unison at odd hours, harassing fishermen, even circling the village at night. Local authorities thought the wolves were rabid or suffering from some other disease. But the village elders told a different story, a darker one. I could still feel their eyes on me as I trudged through the snow towards the small cabin they had assigned to me. I had barely set down my gear when I heard the first howl. It was distant, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. A long, mournful wail that sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped to the window, wiping the frost from the glass with my sleeve. The sky had already turned dark, the sun slipping below the horizon with alarming speed. The village seemed deserted, doors shut tight, windows dark. I had heard wolves howl before. Hell, I had studied them for years. But this sounded different. It was deeper, more guttural, as if something were trapped inside the sound. Almost human. That night, I tried to sleep, but the howling didn't stop. Every few minutes, it would pick up again, a cacophony of eerie, dissonant cries that seemed to bounce off the snow-covered trees. At times, it seemed close, too close. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold biting at my face. The village was quiet, save for the wind howling through the gaps in the cabin walls. No one else seemed to be awake. I scanned the tree line just beyond the village, where the darkness pressed in like a wall. My flashlight caught movement, a fleeting shadow just at the edge of the trees. A wolf or something that looked like one. I turned to head back to the cabin when I noticed something strange. Footprints. Large, human-like footprints in the snow, leading away from my door and towards the forest. My breath caught in my throat as I knelt down, examining them more closely. They were fresh, the snow barely disturbed by the wind, and they were headed in the same direction as the shadow. It didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anyone outside at this hour, not in this cold. I stood, my heart pounding in my chest, the village suddenly feeling far more isolated than it had just moments ago. The wolves weren't the only thing out here. The villagers had mentioned something else, something they whispered about when they thought I wasn't listening. A legend, a creature that could change shape, assume the form of any animal it chose. The Skinwalker. I had laughed it off at first, dismissing it as superstition. But as the wind carried another chorus of twisted howls through the night, I wasn't so sure anymore. I returned to the cabin, bolting the door behind me. Tomorrow, I'd explore the forest, set up cameras, track the wolves, and gather data. That was the plan, at least. But as I lay in the dark, unable to sleep, the howls only grew louder, almost as if they were calling my name. By morning, the howling had stopped, leaving the village shrouded in an unsettling silence. The air was colder than the night before, and a thin layer of frost coated everything, glittering under the pale sun. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched the entire night, though I had seen no more shadows outside my window. I tried to ignore the uneasy knot in my stomach as I packed my gear, preparing to head into the forest. The village elder, a man named Elias, met me by the edge of the tree line. His weathered face was lined with years of cold and hardship, but his eyes were sharp, almost too sharp for someone his age. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're going into the woods," he said, more of a statement than a question. I nodded, adjusting my backpack. "I need to see what's going on with the wolves. Their behavior isn't normal," Elias interrupted, his voice low. "You think this is about wolves, but it's not. There's something else out there." I hesitated, recalling the strange footprints I'd found outside my cabin. "You mean the Skinwalker?" Elias's gaze hardened. He spat into the snow. "The Skinwalker isn't just a legend, son. We've lost people. Hunters who knew this land better than anyone. Found their bodies torn apart like animals had gotten to them. But there were no tracks, no signs, just death." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "And you think it's this creature?" Elias didn't answer, but his silence was enough. I turned and headed into the forest, the elder's words lingering in the back of my mind like a dark shadow. The trees were thick, their branches heavy with snow, making the world feel claustrophobic despite the vastness of the wilderness. I followed the tracks I had found the night before, though they had become fainter with time, half covered by fresh snow. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The silence was almost too loud, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Hours passed without incident. I had almost convinced myself that the villagers were just superstitious, that this was all some elaborate tale meant to scare outsiders. But then the howls returned. They started quietly, almost a whisper, before rising in intensity. It wasn't just one wolf, but a chorus, echoing through the trees. I stopped dead in my tracks, scanning the area, but I saw nothing. The howls grew louder, more frantic. I knew wolves hunted in packs, but these cries sounded disjointed, chaotic. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a flash of fur darting between the trees. I froze, crouching low behind a fallen log, my heart pounding in my chest. There, through the gaps in the branches, I saw it. A wolf, but this one was different. It was larger than any wolf I had ever seen. Its fur darker, almost black, and its eyes. Those eyes glowed an unnatural shade of yellow. It moved with an unnatural grace, slipping through the trees as if it were part of the shadows themselves. My breath caught in my throat as it stopped, its head turning towards me. For a brief moment our eyes met. Then, without warning, it let out a deafening howl, one that didn't belong to any wolf. It sounded human. I stumbled back, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. This was no ordinary wolf. My mind raced, flashing back to the legends Elias had warned me about. The Skinwalker, a creature that could take the form of an animal but was still, at its core, something else, something far worse. I fumbled with my camera, desperate to capture evidence of what I was seeing, but my fingers were numb from the cold. The wolf's eyes never left mine as I struggled. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it darted off into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't waste any time. I bolted after it, my heart hammering in my chest. The howls continued, growing louder as I ran deeper into the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere, that this creature wanted me to follow. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to head for the safety of the village, but my body kept moving forward. After what felt like an eternity of running, the howling stopped. I slowed to a halt, my breath ragged in the freezing air. The forest had gone eerily silent again. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings. Then I saw it. In a small clearing ahead, something lay in the snow. A body. I approached cautiously, my heart in my throat. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't an animal, but a human. One of the villagers, a hunter by the looks of him. His body was twisted, limbs bent at unnatural angles, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. The snow around him was stained with blood, but there were no tracks, no sign of what had done this, except for a single set of large, human-like footprints leading away from the body and deeper into the woods. I stared at the tracks, my mind reeling. The Skinwalker was real, and it was hunting. Just as that thought took hold, I heard the howling again. This time it was much closer. Too close. I wasn't alone. I turned to run, but I could feel it. Something was watching me, stalking me from the shadows. The Skinwalker had my scent now, and I knew it wouldn't stop until it caught me. I sprinted through the forest, my lungs burning with every ragged breath, my legs barely able to keep pace with the terror surging through me. The howls echoed all around, bouncing off the trees, disorienting me. I had no sense of direction anymore. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. The creature, whatever it was close. I could feel it, the weight of its gaze on the back of my neck, like a predator watching its prey. The trees thinned as I broke into a clearing, the full moon casting a silver glow over the snow. My boots crunched on the frozen ground as I skidded to a stop, scanning the area for any sign of safety. But the clearing wasn't empty. Standing at the far edge of the clearing was a figure. At first, I thought it might be another villager, but as I squinted in the moonlight, dread crept over me. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. It stood eerily still, watching me with those same glowing yellow eyes I had seen before. The Skinwalker, it didn't move like a wolf anymore. Its body had shifted, twisted into something grotesque and inhuman. A mockery of a man, but wrong, horribly wrong. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, its mouth hanging open in a grin too wide, too sharp. And those eyes, those terrible eyes never blinked. I took a step back, my hands trembling. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt frozen to the spot. The creature tilted its head, as if considering me, and then it did something that sent a cold wave of fear crashing over me. It spoke. Declan. The voice was a twisted parody of a human's, garbled and low, like it had never spoken before. My name came out in a grotesque rasp, as though it had learned it just to taunt me. I stumbled back, tripping over a fallen branch and landing hard in the snow. The creature didn't move, but its grin widened, stretching its face in a sickening way. I scrambled to my feet, finally breaking free from the paralysis of fear, and ran. Behind me, I could hear it, those heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the snow, always just a few paces behind. No matter how fast I ran, it never seemed to fall far behind. It wasn't chasing me, it was toying with me. I crashed through the trees, my body aching from the cold and the exhaustion. I didn't know where I was anymore, but it didn't matter. I just needed to get away to survive. But the howls, they were all around me now, growing louder, closer. They weren't just wolves anymore. The sound was warped, distorted, like the voices of the dead calling out from the darkness. The village. I needed to get back to the village. It was my only chance. I veered to the left, hoping against hope that I was headed in the right direction. My mind raced with everything Elias had told me, the legends, the warnings. The Skinwalker was more than just a myth. It was here, and it had claimed this place as its hunting ground. Suddenly, the trees parted, and I saw it. Lights. The village. Relief washed over me as I burst through the tree line, stumbling into the open. I could see the cabins, the faint glow of fires behind shuttered windows. I screamed, hoping someone, anyone, would hear me, but the village was silent. I pounded on the nearest door, my fists raw from the cold. "Open up, please," I yelled, but there was no response. No movement from inside. I tried another door, then another, but each cabin was the same, dark, silent. The howling was so close now I could feel it in my bones. I turned, backing up against one of the doors, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The shadows danced in the moonlight, but there was nothing there. For a moment I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, it had stopped. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. Emerging from the trees, moving with a slow, deliberate grace, the Skinwalker stepped into the village. Its twisted form loomed over the snow, the moonlight casting long shadows as it approached. It didn't run. It didn't need to. The creature stopped just a few yards away, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I couldn't move. I was trapped, my back pressed against the door, nowhere to go. The village was a ghost town, and the Skinwalker was here to finish the hunt. Suddenly, the door behind me creaked open, and I stumbled backward into the cabin. I turned, half expecting to see Elias or one of the villagers, but the room was empty, lit only by the flickering flames of a dying fire. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the small space. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the creature was gone. The window was frosted over, but through it, I could see the dark silhouettes of the forest, still and silent. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to calm myself, tried to think of what to do next. I was safe, for now, but then I heard it, a soft scraping sound, from inside the cabin. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room, searching for the source. And then I saw them, footprints, large, human-like footprints, fresh in the snow that had blown in through the cracks in the walls. They led straight to the fireplace. The Skinwalker had been inside the whole time. I never stood a chance. With a final, piercing howl, the door burst open, and darkness consumed me.